When we talk about towns and cities within Wales, we note how frequently they have ancient roots, that they come from Welsh history and they're traceable through Welsh history, and they have distinctly Welsh names, typically. Swansea, of course, being the exception, as of course in Welsh it's Abertawe instead of Swansea. But for the most part, the places we've talked about have remained fairly Welsh in origin. However, we're going to talk about a town that didn't start out, or at least from what we understand, did not seemingly start out as a Welsh town. And that town is Wrexham. Trioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast. And we are on episode 253, The Saxon Marcher Town. It's not often that I have to begin with a correction at the start of one of these episodes, but unfortunately I have to do that. From the last Welsh History Podcast main episode we had a bit of a problem in it that I didn't realize at the time, and it was pointed out by a listener on Facebook. The script had a rather silly error. I don't know whether it was an accidental deletion on my part that created the problem, or whether it was something in some of the research I wrote down wrong, or quite what happened. But either which way, there was a slight problem. And that was the episode about colonialism in the 1890s. In the script, I had Sir Garnet Wolsey, and I said at the time that he had family history from Abergavenny. In actuality, Sir Wolsey is of Anglo-Irish origin, and after doing a lot more research after this correction was pointed out, it became apparent that he'd never had family in Wales and had never been from Wales, and he didn't even seem like he'd even been based in Wales. And this is what happens when you have military wings which end up at some point getting Welsh designations that don't actually mean that all of the troops or all of the leadership is from Wales. And this is one of those occasions. It threw me off, and of course I got caught out. So thank you to Kieran Gibbons for catching that one. I hope I said your name correctly. And with that correction, how about we move along and kind of continue to go on about the rest of the story that we're going to talk about today. The origins of Wrexham can be traced back to the early medieval period. That's a key point to all of this. Remember that we're talking about places that receive names that we don't have any history of before that, but it doesn't mean they didn't exist before that. So, aside from what I said at the beginning of this episode, there may have been a Welsh or Roman or Brythonic name, or even an Iron Age name to this area before there's a Saxon name. But the name itself, from the early medieval period, seems to derive from, and I'm probably going to butcher this, my apologies, Rhyhitel Ham, which in Old English, this place means the homestead of the Rhyhitel, which hints at an Anglo-Saxon influence before the Norman conquest, and certainly shows that it may have been a part of Mercia at one time, as well as being a part of Powys and other places, and of course under the control of Gwynedd at one time. It's a bit of a mess in how to designate and how to point out where and what the border was. By the 11th century, Wrexham lay on the contested borderlands between Wales and England. Much like it does today, it's not far away from the border even now, making it a part of what would become known as the Welsh Marches, a frontier zone where loyalties and control shifted frequently between the Welsh and both the Saxons and then the Normans. The Domesday Book of 1086, however, does not mention Wrexham, which probably shows that it lie beyond Norman control at this point. By the 12th century, however, records describe the area as part of the lordship of Bromfield and Yale under the Marcher lords, who ruled through most of the independent princes that existed up until the end of independence. These lords held their own courts, minted coins, and raised armies while the crown tolerated their autonomy as a buffer between England and the native Welsh kingdoms. Within this structure, Wrexham emerged as a local market and administrative centre. The nearby castles at Holt and Dinas symbolized authority and offered protection for trade routes linking the Dee Valley with Cheshire. Archaeological finds and fragments of early pottery and building of stone within the St. Giles Church suggest continuous settlement at least from the 11th century. So, in other words, from about 1,000 years ago. Although, again, we don't really know if there was something before it. A large part of the problem in Britain you're going to find is that any evidence we might have of earlier occupation may be covered by current occupation. Think of the amount of times we discover things when they're ripping down old buildings and all of a sudden, oh, look, there's a Roman burial ground nobody knew about. Or there's an ancient Bronze Age thing that we didn't know existed until this was taken out. And quite consistently, what we've found is that churches, especially early Christian churches, are built in places where there were religious sites of some sort before that. That's pretty common across all of Christianity in that period. And very likely, if you've got a church somewhere, you probably got some sort of worship site for people that lived before that. It's the reason why they built Christian churches there. If that was seen as holy, why wouldn't you continue to see it as holy, but under the Christian auspice? Those kind of things happen quite frequently. However, by the 13th century, Wrexham was recognized as a small but active town. Its parish church, dedicated to St. Giles, as mentioned earlier, was first mentioned initially around this time and gradually expanded over later centuries. The existing tower, built in the late 15th century, remains one of the finest examples of perpendicular Gothic architecture in Wales. Life in the frontier area was shaped by alternating Welsh and English control. Markets were held weekly, fairs drew traders from both sides of the border, as you can imagine. Documents from the Bromfield Court rolls record disputes between Welsh farmers and English burgesses over grazing rights and give us a small glimpse into the daily coexistence at the border and its economy. When Owen Glyndwr raised his standard in 1400, the lordships of the northeast Wales lay in the path of the rebellion. Wrexham, within the Bromfield and Yale area, saw unrest with local supporters joining Glyndwr's forces. Holt Castle, only a few miles away, was besieged, though there is no record of fighting in Wrexham itself. But surrounding villages suffered plunder and crop destruction. After the rebellion collapsed, the region entered a period of recovery, and merchants again looked toward Cheshire for trade, and the parish reestablished its markets. In the 15th and early 16th century, Wrexham thrived as a market center for the Vale of Clwyd and Dee Valley. The fertile land around produced grain, cattle, and especially wool, and by the later 1400s, Welsh wool was exported through English ports to Flanders, and Wrexham merchants were part of a wider network, one that we've talked about at length in how the economy generally worked and how Welsh financing of its farms and much of its agriculture came through having to go through an English middleman, which meant that it was poorer because of that. Crafts such as brewing, tanning, and metalwork developed, aided by the access to water from Grenthro and Clywedog streams. A small community of artisans, smiths, coopers, and weavers served the surrounding countryside, which, again, would make sense. During the War of the Roses, Wrexham stood close to the movement of armies between Cheshire and Shrewsbury. Though it escaped major conflict, Henry Tudor's victory at Bosworth in 1485 brought renewed status to Wales. The Pulston family of Emerald and the Lloyds of Claspower were amongst those who gained office under the Tudors, serving as sheriffs and justices in Denbighshire. The rebuilding of the St. Giles Church around 1500, funded by local gentry and merchants, reflected both the piety and civic confidence. Its soaring towers became a landmark visible across the plain and a statement of prosperity and faith. The eventual rise of the Tudor dynasty with Henry VII's victory at Bosworth brought new opportunities for Wales. Henry's Welsh ancestry gave renewed prestige to native gentry families and strengthened Wales's participation in royal affairs. For Wrexham, this new royal favor mattered. By the 1600s, Wrexham had become one of the most important towns in North Wales. Its population was modest by English standards, but substantial in the Welsh context. The town was known for its brewing industry, producing ale of local consumption and the export across the border. Wrexham ale was mentioned in travel accounts of the time. By the 16th and 17th century, the age of religious and political upheaval, the Reformation reached Wrexham early with the dissolution of the local chantries and changes in church governance. The parish registers, beginning 1538, marked the transition to a more bureaucratic church life. During the English Civil War, Wrexham's proximity to Chester gave it strategic value. The town supplied provisions to the royalist garrisons, but parliamentarians' forces occasionally requisitioned goods and horses. Records show both royalist and parliamentarian sympathizers among the Wrexham gentry. When Chester fell in 1646, trade routes reopened, but disruption had lasting economic effects on the community. In the later 1600s, nonconformity took root. Congregational and Baptist meetings were recorded by 1672, and a Presbyterian chapel was licensed soon after. These congregations laid the foundations for Wrexham's later reputation as a center for dissenting religion. By the 18th century, Wrexham had firmly re-established itself as a commercial hub of the northeast of Wales. The weekly markets, the annual fairs, were noted by travelers such as Thomas Pennant, who described the town in 1770 as, quote, a large, populous, and thriving place, end quote. Small-scale industries lined the Clywedig Valley, fulfilling mills, corn mills, and iron forges, taking advantage of the water power that was around them. The most famous, of course, was the Bersham Iron Works, operated by John Wilkinson, known as Iron Mad Wilkinson. At Bersham, between the 1760s and the 1790s, Wilkinson perfected techniques for boring cannons and steam engine cylinders, vital to James Watts's success. He also cast the first iron boat and promoted the use of iron in everyday structures, thus the reason for the Iron Mad part of his name, or nickname. Wilkinson's work made Bersham one of Britain's leading industrial sites and gave Wrexham as an early place in the Industrial Revolution. His experiments attracted skilled craftsmen, and the surrounding hamlets expanded with worker cottages. Though a reform-minded industrialist rather than a political agitator, Wilkinson remained friends with figures in the American Revolution and in early English reform circles. The Brimbo Ironworks, developed from Wilkinson's holdings, became another cornerstone of Wrexham industry in the 19th century. Under the later ownership of industrialists such as Henry Robertson of Penland Hall, Brimbo grew into one of Wales's largest iron and steel producers. Worker communities sprang up around these sites, and Wrexham's population expanded rapidly. The town became a center of brewing. With the founding of Wrexham Lager in 1882, it would become one of Wales's best-known breweries. Brewing, leatherworking, and brickmaking diversified the economy, assuring that Wrexham was not just a single industry town, but also a regional powerhouse. One of the things we haven't mentioned in here is it also became a very vast mining community, something we will talk a lot more about in future episodes in the next century, when we start to talk about the mining disasters of the early 1900s. Religion, of course, remained a defining feature of local identity. By the early 19th century, Wrexham was a stronghold of Methodism, Congregationalism, and Baptist faiths. Chapels such as Pennybryn, Rosthew, and Tabernacle became centers not only of worship but also of education and mutual aid. Sunday schools taught reading and writing in both Welsh and English, while temperance and literary societies met in chapel vestries. Preachers such as John Jones of Tallysaran visited Wrexham to speak on social and spiritual reform, and of course, he drew large crowds. Nonconformist influence helped shape the debates on disestablishment and civic improvements that would become a major part of the next 50 years. The Elementary Public Education Act of 1870 led to the formation of Wrexham's School Board, which opened along with several other school boards in the 1870s and 1880s. These supplemented older charity and chapel schools and made basic education widely accessible. The new system also offered one of the few respectable professional roles for women, as of course teachers. In 1879, the town opened its first public library under the Public Libraries Act of 1855, providing free reading rooms and lectures, part of a wider Victorian movement to foster self-improvement and literacy. By the mid-Victorian era, Wrexham had evolved into a growing civic center. Creation of the Borough Council in 1857 under the Municipal Corporations Act brought a new local institution, a mayor, aldermen, and councillors. Decisions about water supply, drainage, lighting, and paving were now taken in council chambers rather than by distant landlords. Council minutes from the latter half of the 19th century record lively debates about waterworks and public health. One 1870s discussion centered on whether or not the privately run Wrexham Waterworks Company should be brought under municipal ownership, echoing national arguments about who should pay for progress and who should benefit. The Wrexham and Denbighshire Weekly Advertiser reported these civic disputes in detail, giving miners and artisans a voice in print. Headlines such as "The Miners and the Municipality, a Demand for Fairer Rates," captured the growing belief that the borough council should serve as working class interests. As trade unions branched and miners' lodges expanded in the 1880s, so too did participation in civic politics. Working men saw councils as potential allies in their fight for better housing, sanitation, and public services. By the 1890s, early labor candidates were standing for council seats, backed by local unions and campaigning for municipal reform. Sanitary reform was one of the great battlegrounds in Victorian Britain. Since the mid-century, it was understood that disease thrived in cramped urban housing, and local governments gradually took responsibility for sewers, clean water, and refuse removal. Wrexham's council debated such improvements repeatedly. For instance, in 1878, over a new sewer along Grosvenor Road, after flooding damaged miners' cottages, this would carry into a huge discussion about what to do about it. With the widening of the borough franchise and an increasing awareness of the electorate, Wrexham's municipal elections carried real weight. Civic politics became an extension of social reform, linking miners' cottages and council chambers in the same democratic experiment that was reshaping Britain as a whole. Cultural pride, of course, flourished alongside the industrial progress. Wrexham hosted the National Eisteddfod in 1857, drawing poets and musicians from across Wales. The event, held near the town centre, was praised in the press for its organization and hospitality, reinforcing Wrexham's standing as a cultural capital of the North. Music remained central to civic life. Surprise, surprise, Welsh like to sing. I don't know what to tell you. Male voice choirs such as the Wrexham Philharmonic Society performed regularly, and brass bands from the collieries competed at local Eisteddfodau. Sport also became an emblem of civic pride. Wrexham AFC, something we mentioned previously, was founded, of course, in 1864 at the Turf Hotel beside the racehorse ground, and it provided a rallying point for the community. Matches between Wrexham and local sides like Druids FC drew large crowds, and football, of course, soon eclipsed earlier recreations such as quoits and cockfighting. The Mechanics Institutes and evening classes were then offered for adult education, while Wrexham Literary and Scientific Society arranged lectures on engineering and geology. Such institutions encouraged debates and upward mobility. Language, of course, reflected the town's changing society. Welsh remained strong in the surrounding rural districts and many nonconformist chapels, but English was increasingly the dominant language of commerce and administration. In 1891, the census recorded roughly one-third of Wrexham residents were Welsh-speaking, a clear sign of the Anglicanization that was happening. Nevertheless, Welsh language periodicals such as E Cymru and Banner ac Amserau Cymru circulated widely and ensured that political and cultural issues were discussed bilingually. By the close of the 19th century, Wrexham's identity had transformed. Its origins as a marcher settlement, possibly a Saxon location that merged into the Welsh fact as the border switched sides frequently, had become an industrial and civic center. It was proud of its churches and chapels, and also its foundries and football clubs, as well as its schools and choirs. The town's story mirrors that of modern Wales itself, shaped by industry, sustained by community, and defined by a culture that blended Welsh tradition with the dynamism of a Victorian age where progress was happening at a seemingly rapid pace and people were having to come to grips with so much that remained in that particular discussion. Yet, at the same time, what you can see happening here, and I think it's important to point out, is a slow degradation of the Welsh language in the eastern half of Wales. Quite frequently, we've pointed it out, but I think it's fair to kind of bring forward this argument again that we're seeing as more and more population change is happening, it starts to not only change the dynamic of the language because of so many English speakers moving in, but also it changes the local people because so many people start to realize that if they want to get along, they're going to have to come to grips with all these people that are speaking English around them. And so the Welsh language starts to become less and less important to these people. And so they start to become emerging as English language speakers only. And in the process of that, creating a situation where the Welsh language is retreating back towards the West, back towards its rural roots, but also importantly, back towards the pockets of, for lack of a better word, resistance, where the language remains strong even to this day by comparison to the rest of the country. And it's been a difficult road to kind of reclaim that. Sure, there are people in Wrexham now that are speaking Welsh that are trying to uphold these traditions, but keep in mind that's a relatively modern thing. It didn't start happening really until the latter half of the 1900s and wasn't as strong up until then. And this is what we're seeing is this slow clawing change. And we see it in places like Scotland and Ireland as well. You can see where influence of the overwhelming numbers of English that are moving into an area or the advancement or desire to blend in creates a momentum of its own and the population changes. And so that's something to keep in mind as we go on, because we're going to talk a lot about the changing of the Welsh language and how it's being influenced by the encroachment of Anglo-only speakers in the area. So with all of that, I want to thank you for listening and watching today. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. You can reach out to me on any of the social media, usually at Welsh History Pod. The one exception being Facebook, where it's facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And you can even see, as I said earlier in this episode, people do reach out to me on Facebook, sometimes to correct me. With all that said and done, however, thank you all once again. I appreciate everything you've done, all your comments and support. It is very meaningful for me, and I appreciate it. And until next time, everybody, take care. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcasts is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.